Well, thank goodness that's over. The Voice referendum has been one of the ugliest and most divisive political debates in the past 50 years. It was ugly because it became partisan, that is, party political, and it never should have. Now, we all know the voters always get it right, but we have to look at what went on, what the lessons are, and how voters were let down by the failure of the political class to deliver a bipartisan approach. And just to underline the party politics involved, the ramifications of the overwhelming no vote are already being overinterpreted. Trying to spin this as an anti-Labor vote or a pro-coalition vote is pretty pointless. Voters are not fools. They voted on the Voice issue, not on who they think should govern the country. Anthony Albanese loses a bit of personal skin for sure. It's a humiliation for him. And Peter Dutton has proven to his team that he can run a disciplined and tight campaign. So that's good for him. But that's it for the party political ramifications. This shouldn't have any bearing on the next federal election. For all the partisan point scoring you're hearing now, this should be a distant memory when we next go to the polls. Remember Robert Menzies and Bob Hawke, the longest serving Prime Minister of all time and the longest serving Labor Prime Minister, they both lost referenda, then won elections. The really important thing that has happened here, the historically significant event that will alter the direction of this country for perhaps decades to come, is that an idea that was worked up over a couple of decades, an idea that was workshopped between politicians on all sides with constitutional experts and a vast array of Indigenous people and organisations, well, it's been flatly rejected. The Voice had extraordinarily wide support across Indigenous people as the practical and meaningful way they wanted to be recognised in the Constitution. That will probably never happen now, and there must be grave doubts that constitutional recognition in any form can be achieved inside the next couple of decades, even though both sides of politics say they support it. Already today, Peter Dutton has walked away from his pledge to hold another referendum to deliver a different form of recognition, not that Indigenous people have asked for it, and he seems to be walking away from his promised local and regional voices too. All this is a bizarre outcome, actually, because listen to the things the major parties agree on. They both agree that the current state of Indigenous affairs and Indigenous disadvantage is a national disgrace. They both agree that Indigenous people need some form of representation, some form of voice, taking grassroots concerns to government. And they both agree that Indigenous people should be recognised in the Constitution. Yet the carefully devised plan to try to deliver all that, requested by Indigenous Australians in the Uluru Statement, has been rejected. So we are left with the status quo. Mark my words, you'll hear some promises over the next few days, but nothing will change in any meaningful way for some time yet. In fact, within days, Indigenous affairs will go back to where it normally is in the national debate, barely heard about. And that's the way some people will like it. And the open questions, the difficult ones, they'll be left for another time. State governments will go ahead with voices and treaties, and the activists will still push for national action, and we won't have a national representative body to try to navigate these issues. And the worry is that in the future we're going to hear more radical stuff from the Lydia Thorpe types, the black sovereignty types. They'll ramp it up now, and with what others thought was the middle path being rejected, more activists will drift to those radical groups. The coalition has successfully defeated the Voice, but it doesn't have a plan yet. Besides, it's not in government, so it can't do anything. Let's hope that Dutton and Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price can put a plan together, ready for when they do end up in government again, because an audit of spending is not a plan. It's just something that the coalition should have done last time they were in government, just over a year ago, and something that should actually happen all the time. So I know we all want to put this behind us, but we'll be back to it sometime. It's all unfinished business. Now, of course, there was no surprise that the Voice was defeated. The polls have been making that clear for many, many weeks. And the voting outcome was pretty much exactly what the polls predicted. The real question is how the Yes campaign turned 60-40 support earlier this year into a 40-60 trouncing. And to my mind, it all started at this moment.
Together, we can embrace the Uluru Statement from the heart. We can answer its patient, gracious call for a voice enshrined in our Constitution.
Yeah, election night last year. I was there that night covering it for Sky News, and as a Voice supporter, I winced because the only hope for success always was bipartisan support. I remember speaking to Linda Burney at that function and warning that that sort of triumphalism put the whole project at risk. How can you deliver bipartisan support if you claim this is some great Labor reform on election night? And the reason the Voice was dispatched on the weekend is because there was no bipartisan support. No referendum has passed without both major parties backing it. And the person who must take the bulk of the blame for that is Albanese. After setting the wrong tone on election night, he failed then to do enough to get the coalition on board. He was too eager to go ahead without them. Now, I don't give Dutton a free pass. He has to wear some of the blame. You'd have to be incredibly naive not to see how the coalition has used this issue for base party political purposes. And as I pointed out in the campaign, many of the No campaign's attacks and lines were deceptive and deliberately divisive. But the onus is on the Prime Minister. Having decided to put this to a vote, he needed to make sure it succeeded. He needed to ensure it could improve the nation, not tear it apart. He failed to get that agreement. He failed to offer any compromise. He failed to delay the referendum until he could forge some common ground. And then he failed to provide the detail about how he would legislate a voice, detail that would have comforted many voters. And his campaign gave us all the predictable mistakes you get from the left. Despite the warnings, they pushed out celebrities, they trumpeted corporate and sports organisations supporting them. They focused on emotionalism when they should have provided that detail and debated the key criticisms and tried to win over the mainstream right of centre, the voters they were always going to need. But the government went with a woke and leftist vibe, and it turned people off in their droves. Some corporates, I only learned this on the weekend, some corporates even had mandatory training for their staff on the Voice. Can you believe that? It's like workplace propaganda. I mean, if you were thinking of voting yes, that'd turn you into a no voter pretty quickly, wouldn't it? Anyway, that's where we are. All that for the status quo. All that pain and division to end up with the status quo that we all know, we all recognise is deplorable. As I said on Thursday and again on Saturday night, voters have been let down by the political class, the major parties, the media, the corporates, the unions and the academics. We've been put through a process that took voters for mugs, wasted a lot of goodwill and achieved nothing. It never should have happened this way. They needed to find some common ground. Surely no referendum will be put to the public again without bipartisan support. Many no voters will be proud that the No campaign have saved the country, that they reckon has saved the country from what they thought was a risky proposal. Many other no voters, and some I've spoken to, are angry they were forced to vote on a vague proposal, a pig in a poke, when they didn't want to reject Indigenous aspirations, but with the lack of detail they felt they had no other option. And yes, many yes voters, including the overwhelming majority of Indigenous voters, will be shattered that a once-in-a-lifetime chance to advance reconciliation has been derailed by partisan politicking and poor campaigning. Excuse me 1 second. And on all these counts, the blame lies primarily, of course, with Anthony Albanese and his government. By arrogantly trying to pursue this as a great Labor victory, they've let Indigenous people and the country down. They've sent reconciliation backwards. Poor fellow, my country.